Of course, I will create a supernatural account of the Titanic before its sinking, focusing on the supernatural events involving people and workers who died during its construction. I will divide the story into parts, respecting the 5,000 character limit per chat. Here is the first part. Belfast, Northern Ireland, 1911. The Harland and Wolff shipyard was bustling with activity as the imposing RMS Titanic took shape. The ship that promised to be the largest and most luxurious in the world was nearing completion, but an ominous aura already hung over it. I, Thomas O'Brien, was a young apprentice carpenter, eager to be part of the team that built this floating wonder. Little did I know that my experience aboard the Titanic would be far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. It all began on a cold October morning. The sky was gray, and a thick fog enveloped the shipyard. I was working on the upper deck when I heard a muffled scream coming from somewhere below. I ran to the edge and saw a group of men gathered around, something on the ground. As I approached, my stomach dropped. It was the body of John Murphy, a veteran welder. Murphy had fallen from a scaffold, his head hitting a steel beam hard. The scene was horrific, and shock washed over us all. It was the first fatal accident I had witnessed while building the Titanic, but unfortunately, it would not be the last. Over the next few weeks, a series of strange incidents began to occur. Tools would mysteriously disappear, only to reappear in unlikely places. Lights would flicker inexplicably, and some workers swore they heard whispers coming from empty compartments. At first, we thought it was just the fatigue and stress of hard work playing tricks on our minds. But then something happened that we could not ignore. It was a particularly dark night, and I was working overtime, finishing work on one of the first-class suites. Suddenly, I felt a sharp chill run down my spine. The air around me grew heavy, and I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. When I turned, I saw a translucent figure standing in the doorway. My heart raced as I recognized the face. It was John Murphy. His eyes were blank, and a pained expression contorted his features. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. In a blink, the apparition was gone, leaving me shaking and confused. In the days that followed, I discovered that I was not alone in my experience. Other workers began reporting similar encounters. A painter swore he had seen the ghost of a young apprentice who had been crushed to death by a steel plate weeks earlier. A seamstress working on the interior said she heard a child's cry coming from one of the lockers, only to find it empty when she opened it. The tension in the shipyard was palpable. Many workers refused to be alone in certain areas of the ship, especially at night. Some even quit, unable to cope with the constant fear. The supervisors tried to stifle the rumors, chalking it up to stress and overactive imaginations. But we knew the truth. The Titanic was becoming a magnet for the restless souls of those who had lost their lives in its construction. As the ship neared completion, the supernatural events intensified. One night, while working in the first-class dining room, I witnessed something I will never forget. The dining room was silent, lit only by a few work lamps. I was polishing the final details of the wood paneling when I heard the sound of footsteps echoing across the floor. Turning, I saw a procession of ethereal figures entering the room. They were the spirits of the workers who had died during the construction of the Titanic. Led by John Murphy, they moved silently, their eyes fixed on something I could not see. I recognized faces: the crushed young apprentice, an electrician who had died from electrocution, a painter who had fallen from a scaffold. Their translucent bodies glowed with a blue light, casting dancing shadows on the ornate walls. Paralyzed by fear and fascination, I watched as they sat at the tables, as if they were attending a macabre banquet. Murphy, the silent leader, raised a ghostly glass in a somber toast. It was then that I realized they were staging their own version of the inaugural dinner they would never get to experience. The air turned chilly, and I could see my breath forming clouds of steam. The spirits began to murmur to each other, their voices an unintelligible whisper that seemed to come from every direction. Suddenly, all heads turned toward me. Dozens of opaque eyes stared at me, and I felt as if they were looking right into my soul. Murphy stood up and started walking toward me. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. When he was only a few feet away, he opened his mouth to speak. The sound that came out was like the grinding of twisted metal, making my bones vibrate. "Be careful," he said, his voice a distant echo. "The ship, fate sealed. Many more will join us." Before I could process his words, a cold wind swept through the room, and in the blink of an eye, all the spirits were gone. I stood there, shivering, for several minutes before I found the strength to move. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But Murphy's words echoed in my mind, a dark omen that I couldn't ignore. As the Titanic neared its completion, the supernatural events seemed to diminish. Some workers speculated that the spirits had finally found peace. Others, like me, feared that this was just the calm before the storm. Launch day arrived, and Titanic was greeted with great pomp and circumstance. As the crowds cheered and the flags waved, I couldn't help but feel a knot in my stomach. Looking up at the mighty ship, I thought I saw for a moment familiar faces in the cabin windows, the faces of those who had died to build her. When Titanic set off on her test voyages, I decided I could no longer be a part of it. I resigned and left Belfast, carrying with me the weight of the secrets I had witnessed. Months later, when news of Titanic's sinking arrived, I was not surprised. Murphy's words came back to me with frightening clarity. The ship's fate had been sealed long before she encountered that fateful iceberg. In the years that followed, I heard stories from survivors who recounted strange experiences during her maiden voyage. Some spoke of mysterious voices echoing through the empty corridors, others of shadowy figures seen in the corners of cabins. One account in particular caught my attention. A first-class passenger swore that on the night of the sinking she had seen a procession of spectral figures led by a man who matched John Murphy's description. They walked calmly across the deck, oblivious to the chaos around them, as if they were guiding the souls of those who were about to join them. Today, decades after those events, I am still haunted by memories of what I saw on the Titanic. Sometimes, in my dreams, I find myself back in that dining room, surrounded by the spirits of those who died, and I always wake up with Murphy's words echoing in my ears. Many more will join us. The Titanic may be at the bottom of the ocean, but I am certain that the spirits that inhabited it are still there, trapped between our world and the next, an eternal testament to the tragedy that was destined to happen from the beginning. Years passed, and I tried to move on with my life. I moved to London, got married, and had children. But the memories of the Titanic and its ghosts never completely left me. Sometimes, on dark, silent nights, I could swear I could hear the distant echo of those spectral voices. In 1955, almost half a century after the sinking, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a man named William Murdoch, who claimed to be the nephew of Officer William McMaster Murdoch, who had served and perished on the Titanic. Young Murdoch had been researching his uncle's story and had somehow learned about my experiences during the building of the ship. Reluctantly, but feeling that perhaps it was time to share my story, I agreed to meet him. On a rainy autumn afternoon, we met in a small London cafe. William was a quiet, thoughtful man, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of a tragic family history. As I recounted my experiences, I watched William's face change from disbelief to fascination, and finally to grim understanding. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. O'Brien," he said, his voice low and trembling. "What you are about to hear may sound crazy, but I swear it is true. My uncle, in the days leading up to the Titanic's maiden voyage, wrote in his diary about experiences that were disturbing." William took a worn leather notebook from his pocket and opened it. The yellowed pages were filled with a tight, nervous handwriting. He began to read. April 10th, 1912. "Something is wrong with this ship. Last night, while on my watch, I saw a figure on the deck. I thought it was a passenger, but as I got closer, I realized I could see right through him. The man turned toward me, his face a mask of pain, before disappearing into thin air. I am reluctant to report this to the captain, They will think I have gone mad. My blood ran cold at the words. William continued. April 11th, 1912. The visions are getting worse. I hear voices in the empty corridors, muffled screams coming from the hold. Today, I saw a group of spectral figures gathered in the first-class dining saloon. They seemed to be performing some kind of dark ceremony. One of them, a man with a horrific head wound, saw me and said, "Brace yourselves. Fate cannot be changed." I fear what this may mean. William closed the journal, his eyes meeting mine. The last entry is dated April 14th, hours before the sinking. My uncle wrote that he saw a procession of spirits walking calmly across the deck, led by a man who matches his description of John Murphy. We were silent for a long moment, the implications of those words hanging heavy between us. Finally, William spoke again. "Mr. O'Brien, I believe that what you and my uncle experienced was no coincidence. The Titanic was doomed from the start, marked by the souls of those who died to build her." In the years that followed that encounter, William and I stayed in touch, sharing our research and discoveries. We met others who had similar experiences, survivors of the sinking, family members of victims, even divers who explored the wreck in the decades that followed. All reported the same feeling, that the Titanic was not just a ship, but a portal between our world and the afterlife, a place where the living and the dead coexisted in a macabre dance of fate. Today, at 95, I am one of the last survivors of that era. As I write these words, I cannot help but think of all those spirits, the workers who died during construction, the passengers and crew who perished in the sinking. Do they still roam the underwater corridors of the Titanic? Or have they finally found peace? One thing I know for sure, the story of the Titanic is more than a tragedy at sea. It is a reminder that there are forces beyond our comprehension, that sometimes fate is sealed long before we realize it. And as the sun sets on the horizon, I cannot help but wonder, are the ghosts of the Titanic still there at the bottom of the Atlantic, waiting to tell their stories to whoever dares to listen? With these words, I end my story. May those who read it find in it not just a tale of terror, but a reminder of the fragility of life and the persistence of the human spirit, even in the face of the darkest of tragedies.